We started a little late, so we might have a little less time for questions, but we'll decide whether we want to cannibalize either the break or the next session. So let's just see who wants to ask a question. Dr. Gutsch, I'm so surprised to see that you stand up.
Well, thank you. I have a little question to Deborah. I thought perhaps you were a little unfair to our letter in the BMJ, because we actually wrote there that no detailed regulatory documents are available from the FDA. Physicians and patients require access to clinical study reports and anonymized individual patient data from trials of approved drugs and biologics. We also refer to the fact that the law already in existence is not being, what is it called in English? It's not being adhered to, so you could do a lot there, but we need access to much more, like we work on in Europe. And therefore, I would like to ask the new FDA commissioner. I had a meeting with one of your colleagues, Peter Lurie, who was deputy commissioner 4 years ago, because we had this breakthrough at the European Medicines Agency where we got access to clinical study reports and protocols. So I asked Peter, for how long can the FDA maintain this extreme secrecy when Americans can get access in Europe to what they can't get access to in the United States? And Peter told me that in the 70s, the US law allowed the FDA either to choose a path of openness and transparency and collaboration, or a path of secrecy. And unfortunately, the FDA chose the path of secrecy that it still suffers from. So when will the FDA open their archives, not only to the Americans, but to everybody? That's one question. The other question is that, you ended by saying that academics should do trials that are relevant for patients. So let me ask, what about all this foolishness that new diabetes drugs can be approved by the FDA just because they lower blood glucose and so on? When will you give up surrogate markers as a basis for approval? These are not relevant for patients.
Thank you. Rob, do you want to answer one or both?
That sounded like a lecture to me. Peter Lurie is still at the FDA. I'll certainly, I understand this is being recorded. I'll get your exact quote and see if that's exactly what he said. I doubt if that's exactly what he said. I'm all for transparency as much as I can be. We do live in a complicated set of laws and oversight, and I can't really give you a date right now when things will change. I will say that I went to the EMA 2 weeks ago, and I didn't detect that we were really in that different a position than the EMA at this point. So I'm sure this dialogue will continue. As far as diabetes goes, you may be aware that I was in the group that led the effort to require outcomes trials in diabetes. The question of when a surrogate can be used and when it can't, as I alluded to, is a pretty complicated question in my view, and not 100% one way or another. And if you've talked to patient groups with ALS or Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, you might have a different view of some of these issues. So, as you well know, the agreement that was reached was, yes, one can get on the market if you've ruled out a clinically serious toxicity of a diabetes drug, but then you must do the outcome trial. And in fact, those are being done and reported.
Good news. Let me just explain. The remark by Peter Lurie was given during a lunch at the FDA. I'm not sure it was recorded on a microphone.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I will ask him if he said what you said he said, because that's a little surprising.
Okay, Stuart.
Another question for Rob. Is there any chance that the FDA could establish some sort of data enclave akin to what the Census Bureau has with its research centers, where independent investigators could come to the site and get access to basically all the clinical trial data, the patient-level data that the FDA has access to?
Well, Stuart, bear with me a little bit, because I think you know full well, I think you were just at the FDA, and there's a lot of interest in what you just described. So you have some insight that we're working on it. But we do exist in a fishbowl, and we have to make sure that we've covered all of our bases in the way that we go about it. I mean, I know it's no surprise to you that if we had, one reason to develop common data standards is not just to make our reviews easier to do, it's to create the circumstance for the kind of thing that you just described. So there's a great interest in that within the FDA. But again, we have to work out all the details, and we have to make sure that we're covering ourselves in terms of the legal requirements that we have.
Thank you.
Stuart, by the way, can I just say, randomization is so critical to us. I think one of the most important things that you all can do is to work with the public more to understand the importance of randomization. I know Stuart is working hard on that, but we need help because there's a lot of feeling that you can just analyze data and answer these questions without randomization.
Thanks. Dan, we'll go there next.
Okay, matrix privilege, I guess. Daniele Fanelli, matrix. I just had a quick comment for the second speaker in particular about the fact that most of the recommendations made are generally condivisible. Certainly finding new dimensions along which to measure quality is unquestionably true. But the underlying assumption that, particularly the publish or perish story, I see increasingly evidence that suggests is probably wrong, or at least we are getting it in too much of a simplistic way. Now, I won't expand on this, but I'll be happy to share more information with you later. What I'm saying is that if the underlying theory is wrong, and so if we're not as rigorous as we should be with the science, then initiatives and policies as important as those in the Netherlands about, for example, ignoring the quantity aspect, might not actually have, you could argue, hopefully no effect, or even, effects that are counterproductive.
Frank?
The question is, do you really believe what you say? And yeah, and I do believe, because I think that that was a question. I took it rightly, I guess. So, but I believe what I say, and I think that there's of course, peer to publish is about if you don't publish, you don't get your next round of grants. That is well understood in my circle, and that's why I show the circle, because without good publications, and then science helps a lot. But also New England, I said, if you don't have that top, then it's more difficult to make a career. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to show that in the literature, sociology of science, science of science, STS, we can share that in the corridor. But also, if you're the dean and you do this for 6 years, you can see exactly how committees in your own house are making decisions. And we now study that together with the Center for Science and Technology Studies in Leiden, and to do interventions. So we now say to committees, go for other impacts next to the classical metrics, and now we try to prove, hopefully, that they will go for other choices, that they can now take somebody from sports medicine who never published in Nature and Science, but has very strong societal impact and clinical impact for people with trauma of the knee, for instance, because we all want to play tennis when we're 60 with 3D cartilage print for our knee. And so I strongly believe my own talk. Yes.
We have as many minutes as we have people lined up, so we'll have to pursue that in the breakout groups. So over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tracy Brown from Sense About Science. We established the All Trials campaign in Europe. And I'm really right with you, Deb, on use what we've got, make better use of what we got. But I want to throw that back to you guys up there, because Robert, you told my colleague that you are looking again at fines from the FDA. Fines from the FDA for non-compliance with requirements on clinical trials reporting would be incredibly useful, not because the odd $10,000 here and there makes a huge difference to the companies, but because we now have 3.8 trillion euros worth of investors in Europe lined up behind clinical all trials agenda, and it's growing support in the US on the same basis. The question they ask the companies they invest in is, have you been fined by the FDA for any non-compliance? You know already that something like $40 billion worth of fines were issued to companies over the last 8 or 9 years. 43% of those were directly related to minimizing side effects identified during the trials. These are marketing infringements. Those are already questions that investors are asking companies about, and we want them to be asking about FDA fines too. So I'd really like you to comment on that. And I'd also like, Deb, for you to comment on the fact that ct.gov has, for one reason or another, become probably the best place in the world for people to put the results of their clinical trials. And I think you kind of hide your light under a bush. There's all sorts of political reasons internationally why it's awkward that it's an American trials database that is the very best in the world and would serve everyone in the world very well. But I think at some point, don't we have to be really honest that the medical journal system is not the best way to report clinical trials, and maybe that you offer the way forward and be less shy about having that conversation.
Okay, we have 2 potent questions on the table.
I mean, I'll go first, and maybe we can have a little back and forth on the second question because it's a good one.
If you could clarify what the 2 questions were.
First question is, why not be more vigorous about the fines?
Yeah, if you're wondering, it's a little hard to hear up here.
Yeah, it's very hard.
With some
Sorry.
So
and to see.
we're sort of guessing what the questions are. But I mean, I'm acutely aware of the importance of compliance, and Deborah knows that I used to pester her, and you know, if I had stayed at Duke, there would be a website right now that had every university and every company and the reporting rates. And some of my colleagues that I worked with before leaving are here now, and I understand there was just a paper, I think, in BMJ about companies, but same thing needs to be done with universities. The fine part of this, you know, what I learned when I went to the FDA is the FDA is really good on enforcing compliance, and as you pointed out, it's actually the Department of Justice that deals with the off-label promotion issue that you mentioned. They brought in $43 billion to the U.S. Treasury. It's a big weapon, but when you use it, you'd better make sure you have everything lined up, because if Stanford got a $10,000 a day penalty by the FDA, you know, it would be a huge deal. We're aware of it. But we're getting close. I think we're pretty close to be ready to enforce. We'll give people plenty of notice, and when we give notice, I suspect shops will be cleaned up in a hurry. Deborah, I don't know what you think.
Yeah. And Deb, your question
Okay, just on that question, I think also even before maybe fines are levied, once the final regulations are out and once the NIH policy is finalized, which we do expect in our lifetime, sooner, while we're all still in our current jobs, let's just say that, there will be an easier ability for even at clinicaltrials.gov to have a sponsor-specific list in terms of rates of reporting. It's impossible for us to do it now because there's enough ambiguity in the law about which trials have to report and when that we would get in big trouble if we tried to do it. But once it's very clear, then we'll be able to have a list, and I think that will be useful. Some of you may have heard me, I give talks where I anonymize the top 10 drug companies, top 10 device, and top 10 academic medical centers by revenues and give their reporting rates. And I can tell you that after I give those talks, especially for the academic medical centers, I usually get 3 or 4 different deans come up to me and ask if they were the number 9 or 10. Usually it turns out the one who is the number 9 or 10 knows it very well, but the others, so it's a pretty effective thing to do. It's a Don Burwickian thing to do, is just to show that. But I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Well, I think we're going to have to move on to if there's any chance.
It's worth just a comment from you, because we argue about
results
this all
reporting
the time.
around the world.
Should we just do away with journals and just report the results?
I'll say, so my feeling about, I think that honestly, I'm a true believer. I believe that structured results reporting has great value, and that's what you have through FDOT, clinicaltrials.gov. We hold people's feet to the fire with their pre-specified outcome measures and require reporting all the serious adverse events and other things. Nobody is used to that. Everyone hates it, but you end up with very valuable data that's pretty computable so that you can more easily, some of the things I think that a speaker was saying, if only we could do this, if only we could do that. We can do some of that already. And in fact, a colleague of ours in the Netherlands is doing it for the Dutch Medicines Agency, is taking structured results from clinicaltrials.gov and in an automated way doing it.
But that's in the Netherlands. That's in the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands. Yeah. But I know, it's the best place. But they're using our data. But there is a problem, which is that all of the registries in the WHO primary registry network, of which there are, I think, 17 right now, want their own results database, including, for example, the Sri Lankan registry, which has a total of 177 trials and an annual budget of, I think, $18,000 US, and all these other registries want their own results database. And not that I think we should be the only one, but I don't think that you need to have 20. I don't think that would be good for the world, and we can talk about that later.
Okay, thank you. Marissa, and then David.
Well, that brings up my point, because as an associate editor of a journal, and I look at trial protocols, I always go to clinicaltrials.gov, but often they're not registered with clinicaltrials.gov because it's not a North American country, and so I then go to the WHO umbrella organization that I think draws from all the different registries, and you can look in one place to see whether a trial is underway and so forth. So one question is, do you know how well they actually extract the data from, say, clinicaltrials.gov into that WHO repository? And the second thing is, I've also noticed that that sometimes the primary endpoint of a trial has changed. You go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look at the very last, the last amendment, and you can see that that is the primary endpoint. But when you start to dig down to the very first time it's been uploaded, it's a completely different endpoint. And I'm just wondering whether there's a way of flagging that immediately on the website as like a red alert. I mean, you don't want too many alerts, but some way that you know that there has been a substantial change in the protocol.
Second question first, which is that when you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look at a record, pick the tabular view. It will default to the full text view. Go to the tabular view, and there you will see, for the primary outcome measure, you'll see the initially registered and then the current.
Oh, but sometimes it
will literally flag the first and the last, and it will have a live link to our archive site where you can see every change in between. So we try to meet that need in the tabular view, which is more for researchers and a little bit less user-friendly for the lay public, but that's why we do that.
Good.
The ICTRP, which is the WHO portal, they fully download all of our data. They download data from the other registries. What they don't do optimally in my mind, and I don't think they can because it's just structurally a terrible situation, is they don't deduplicate perfectly, so that you can have many entries that look like different trials, but they're the same trial. And it's very hard to do, and there's sort of a bit of world chaos, so that, for example, going back to Paxil, one of the fundamental reasons was you want to know how many trials were there, and do we have results for all of them? And we think that that's something, we have an article in Press showing the level of hidden duplicates that we think are in there. So that's a problem that hasn't been solved internationally.
Thanks. I just want to warn, we may not get to everybody who's online because we're already in overtime. But Dave Magnus.
Thanks very much. This is a great panel. Earlier today, we heard a lot of talk about maybe exposing peer review for both articles and grants to itself a research process to see what the impact of peer review is. But nobody's yet suggested applying that to science policies. We've got a lot of proposed regulations coming out, changes to regulations, changes to laws. Shouldn't we make more of an evidence-based science policy by figuring out ways of doing research, maybe even randomized research, to find out what impact it has when you have one set of policies rather than another on the conduct of research and the protection of subjects, and let that to try and make a more evidence-based science policy?
You know, I heard a statement around somewhere in Washington a couple of weeks ago that 1% of policies are based on randomized evidence, if you look at all policies. And one thing, but I will say one thing I was surprised to find was within the White House, there is a group that has been charged and is doing randomized trials of policy interventions. And it's not mostly biomedicine. It's mostly social policies. And it's sort of an experimental group, but they've done a number of things, and it appears to be working from what I'm told, that people actually are resonating to the concept that you'd actually know what the right policy is at the end of the study. But we got a long way to go in that regard. I think it's a great suggestion.
Can I just add something? I think that historically, laws used to be written a bit more broadly, and then the executive branch, the regulation, had more leeway in terms of how they wrote the regulations, which would leave room for trying it in different ways. Recent history is that the law of you take FDAA literally got to the level of saying which data elements we needed to require. So if the law is written at that level of specificity, it doesn't leave the executive branch much room. There wouldn't be much to randomize. And so that's a political science issue that I think is worth debating, but that's the situation we're in now.
Great, thanks. So apologies to the questions that didn't get posed, but hopefully those can come in at other sessions or in the breakout sessions. So let's thank our speakers.